Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Marcus Soler, and I am the Deputy Secretary for Public Safety for Governor Hochul. With me are my colleagues, the Superintendent of State Police, Steve James, and the Deputy Secretary Commissioner for the Division of Criminal Justice Services, Joe Pupkin. We are here to discuss the work that the administration has done, the Governor Hochul administration has done with regards to gun violence, and we want to give you an update on the data that we see on the progress made. As you all know, I'll frame the conversation, and then Mr. Pupkin and Superintendent James will delve into the data. As you know, COVID swept the United States and New York, and then at the same time, we have lethal and gun violence sweeping entirely both New York and the United States to levels not seen since 1990s. There are many factors that took place that explain what that happens, but there are three things that are common in the United States and certainly in New York that we have seen in most jurisdictions. The first thing, obviously, was violence intensified in traditional pockets where we have had highly concentrated levels of violence over time. So we saw that intensification of the concentration, and we saw, therefore, big increases in big areas like New York City, Rochester, etc. We saw also violence spread across neighborhoods that have not impacted as much, haven't been impacted as much by gun violence, and where we saw, therefore, more people were impacted. We saw that it not only impacted large cities, but also impacted medium cities, small cities, rural areas, and ultimately impacted vulnerable neighborhoods across the state. More people, therefore, were most likely to experience violence. And in response to that, the administration developed in 2021 and 2022 a plan to address the gun violence. In our budget, we have invested more than $347 million this year. We develop a number of initiatives and strategies. And what we want to tell you, and we develop partnerships that were not there before. And what we want to tell you is about three basic facts that I think are important in order to set the framework for the success of our initiatives. The first one is nationally, what we see is that homicides and gun homicides in particular, fatal shootings, are starting to fall. But however, they remain at higher levels than any time since 1990s. That's not the case in New York. That's not the case of New York precisely because our initiatives, particularly outside New York City and the rest of the state, homicides and gun homicides have not just fallen. Most importantly, they are at the lowest level than they have been since we started to track this data. Specifically, murder data shows that in New York, we had the lowest level in murder rate since 1968 outside New York City for the rest of the state, for all the jurisdictions outside New York City. We see in the GIFT jurisdictions, the jurisdictions then where we invest heavily on anti-gun violence programs, we see fatal shootings, gun homicides, also at the lowest levels that we can see on record. And we see that the city is making progress also to approaching the historic lows of 2017, 2019. So certainly, when it comes to fatal shootings, gun homicides, we see a progress that we don't see in other jurisdictions, and we think it's very much connected to the investments and the work and the partnerships that we have developed. The second is when it comes to non-fatal shootings or all kinds of shootings, what we see is a similar pattern. Outside New York, in the United States, what we see is levels that are still quite high relative to the pandemic. That's no longer the case in New York. In New York, specifically in the 28 places where we invest in, again, the GIFT program, the GIFT jurisdictions, shootings not only has fallen significantly, as Mr. Pupkin will mention, but more than 30%. The year-to-date number shows that we have the lowest rate on record, and there is additional information that is available to you. Finally, what we see is by comparison. New York is not right now particularly, again, outside New York City, where most of our investments take place, among the safest states in the nation, and certainly the safest, biggest state in the nation. When you look at New York, and you compare New York numbers, current numbers, a murder rate, for instance, of 2.2 murders per 100,000, and you compare it to similar states, only Rhode Island, Iowa, New Hampshire, Utah, Hawaii, Maine are performing better than that part of the state. And when you look at the entire state, our numbers, as I said before, are better than the other 10 largest states and better than most of the largest states biggest states in the United States. So I'm going to let my colleague, Mr. Popkin, talk a little bit more about these initiatives and the specific data that we see by concrete regions here in New York. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcos. Thank you, Deputy Secretary Soler. Good afternoon. I'm Joe Popkin, Executive Deputy Commissioner at the Division of Criminal Justice Services. I'm happy to be here today on behalf of DCJS Commissioner Rossana Rosado. DCJS, as you know, is the state's multifunction support agency that advances all aspects of the justice system, from crime prevention through reentry. As Marcos outlined, Governor Hochul's investments and initiatives to combat gun violence are working. We see significant progress throughout New York State, and it has only accelerated in recent months. This effort to turn the tide on gun violence is only possible because of the support and on-the-ground work of our partners in law enforcement and government throughout the state. We thank them for all their work and the efforts of their counterparts in the community who are creating safer, stronger neighborhoods. In our gun-involved violence elimination, or GIVE initiative sites, which cover the major metropolitan areas outside of New York City, through April 2024, shooting incidents involving injury are down 37% compared to the 5-year average. Shooting victims are down 36%, and people killed by gun violence is down 31%. While this progress in percentage terms is impactful, it is more profound in the context of people. These numbers reflect 84 fewer shootings, 94 fewer victims, and 13 fewer lives lost to gun violence so far this year. Thanks to the governor, state legislature, state agency colleagues, such as Superintendent James, and hundreds of local partners, we have brought New York back to historic lows in gun violence. Even before 2024 began, we saw from 21 to 23, 35% fewer shootings, 36% fewer victims, and 37% fewer deaths. I want to briefly highlight 4 regions and interventions that contribute to this success. First, Western New York, where there were 178 fewer shootings, a 51% reduction from 21 to 23, and shootings are down 39% this year compared to the average. The city of Buffalo has leveraged the state's GIVE initiative, which helps law enforcement implement evidence-based strategies through funding, training, and technical assistance. The Buffalo Police Department implemented micro hotspots, 500-foot by 500-foot grids of the entire city. And they were able to use those grids and the activities that were within them to focus their policing efforts on the few places where violence is most prevalent. Through directed patrols, community engagement, and continuous review of their activity, the police department was able to cut firearm-involved homicides in half. Second, in central New York, there were 42 fewer shootings, a 31% reduction from 21 to 23, and shootings are down another 68% this year compared to the average. The city of Syracuse has embraced the state's Project Rise, a unique program and funding model that brings together community stakeholders to respond to gun violence, invest in solutions, sustain positive programming, and empower communities. The city and community are now coordinating on comprehensive services that improve safety, expand youth opportunity, and build community capacity. Third, in the Hudson Valley, where shootings decreased by 35% over the last 2 years and are down 32% this year, a SNUG program in Westchester County is disrupting the cycle of violence. Through community partners, SNUG deploys a trio of credible messengers, social workers, and case managers who respond to shootings to prevent retaliation, detect emerging conflicts, and resolve them peacefully. In Mount Vernon, the social work team recently helped relocate a family where a young person was at risk of serious harm, and that same team also helped another family navigate and secure much-needed victim assistance to help them after a shooting heal and recover. Finally, in the capital region, where shootings decreased by 8% over the last 2 years and are down 22% this year, the City of Albany and Albany Police Department have been tremendous partners to the state-supported Crime Analysis Center. These centers collect and share intelligence and data among state and local law enforcement agencies. In the capital region, this center has really become the backbone of efforts to deter, investigate, and solve crimes, including 2 recent cases, one where analysts provided real-time support to officers who were responding to a drive-by shooting, and another instance where they connected a series of randomly and seemingly unconnected violent crimes across the region by comparing recovered shell casings. These are only a few examples of the work that happens every day between our state and local partners, and it is the direct result of our collective efforts and Governor Hochul's unparalleled support. I will now turn the program over to our outstanding colleague in state service, New York State Police Superintendent Stephen G. James. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Marcos, and thank you, Joe. Getting illegal guns off of the street is a big part of reducing gun violence, and our members, along with various law enforcement organizations and our partners, we're doing an outstanding job in that regard. We've already seized 802 crime guns for the current year, and we are on pace for the 3rd year in a row to seize more guns than in previous years. So obviously the process that works, we're continuing. Since 2022, we have seized a total of 3,002 guns, which is more than the total number of guns seized from the previous 5 years combined. This is being accomplished through our target-related strategies. We've formed the Interstate Task Force on Illegal Guns to collaborate with our law enforcement partners in neighboring states, just not within the confines of New York State, along with our federal partners, and particularly with the local PDs and with NYPD. Sharing our tactics and our strategies in preventing gun trafficking across the entire spectrum of the state. So in doing so, we've formed the Community Stabilization Units to help municipalities, the localities, right, the local PDs, the local entities, to deal with the increased gun violence. We've leveraged our partnerships continually on other task forces and local agencies. It works out to be symbiotic. So where there's a gap, we look to bridge that, whether it's the state or local entities. We continue to see payoff in that regard. Since May 1st, our Community Stabilization Unit, particularly in Troop D, which is in central New York, seized 19 illegal guns, including 14 ghost guns. And the troops assigned to our GIVE, our Gun-Involved Violence Elimination Initiative, in the city of Rochester, just this past week, they seized 7 guns, firearms, in totally separate cases. So we've also continued to use, to strengthen the red flag laws to remove guns from people who pose a danger to themselves and certainly posing a danger to others. And so far this year, we've filed 673 extreme risk protection orders, ERPOs, resulting in the removal of 1,226 guns. So I want to close by offering my gratitude to Governor Hochul for the resources that are being provided to help us focus on the public safety mission. Just yesterday, we graduated 228 new troopers, the first class to attend the State Police Academy from Casanova in New York in the old Casanova College. It's a commitment made by the governor to hold consecutive academy classes for law enforcement, and this gives us the manpower, the staffing that we need to complete all of the many missions that we're certainly up for in the months and years to come. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to open it up for on-topic questions. We're going to have a presentation of the data that I mentioned today. Anybody have any questions? Josh?
Given the successes you guys are explaining, at what point do you guys believe that the state of emergency on gun violence would no longer be relevant?
2 things. One, there is no longer an executive order on gun violence, but at the same time, we will never take a victory lap because, as Joe indicated, these are the lives of people. Unfortunately, far too many murders or shootings are too many. So from our perspective, we will continue to push, and the commitments from the governor out there to continue to invest $350 million every year to address the problem of gun violence and to have a long-term sustained strategy to continue to lower those numbers, both the murder numbers and the shooting numbers, not just to the current historic lows that I mentioned, but to continue to bring it down to whatever level lower we can do, is a commitment of this administration. Thank you.
This isn't a mainstay of this report, but I'm curious of any thoughts you have on hospitals and how that factors into the fatalities data, specifically the availability simply to get somebody to a hospital for urgent medical care. Is that something that's on the radar, and how's that factoring into this?
I will let my colleague Joe to address that, since we have a partnership that we find with hospitals, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. So as a part of our SNUG strategy, so SNUG historically was a $3 or $4 million program. The governor has invested over the last 2 years $21 million into SNUG, and with that funding, we expanded to also include hospital-based street outreach workers. So many of our 14 SNUG communities now have partnerships with hospitals where they have outreach workers there who are able to de-escalate a situation when somebody is brought in, and then follow up with them for the continuity of care. So it's working really, really well across the state, particularly in Syracuse and Rochester, Buffalo, a few others, but I'm happy to follow up with you to provide more information.
John, specifically about these statistics that I'm looking at here, it said shooting incidents with injury. Does that involve one victim, multiple victims, and are potential suicide events also included in those numbers?
So suicide events would not be included in these. These are reported from the police departments, and they're any shooting incident that involved any type of injury, so any kind of bullet-to-body injury. So that's where we get the victim data and also the people who are succumb to those injuries, the fatality data.
Let me address it additionally on the issue of suicides and in some instances also accidents. We also track primarily through partnership with the CDC, the national CDC, the firearm mortality rate. And what I can tell you is firearm mortality rate in New York is the 4th lowest in the entire United States. And it's a partnership that we continue to push, not just obviously through working on our issue to address gun violence and illegal guns, et cetera, but also to address, in many instances, through strategies like airpods, because we think that there is a lot of people who have access to guns who also want to harm themselves. So certainly, this is a global strategy for us, not just limited to certainly the problem of street gun violence. The problem of accidents and the problem of suicides is certainly a priority of this administration.
One more question, Josh.
Possibly for Superintendent, obviously in the city of Albany, gun violence has stayed persistent, almost an outlier to the rest of the state. And city police and city officials often talk about it's one-off incidents, it's domestic issues, things of that nature. How do you guys look at that data point, but also understand the facts that are the case there? How do you guys kind of look at that and figure out whether or not your initiatives in Albany need to be tinkered with are effective, especially if the domestic issues are those successfully being implemented here?
Yeah, and to answer that, and that's part and parcel of what we're doing with the data. That's a first start, right? You have to have a starting point to make that assessment, not the only factor. Intel, it's working with other PD with best strategies to see what has been most effective, what aspects seem to, whether it's seasonal, whether it's the time of year, whether there are events, whether it's gang violence that leads to particular gun use. So good question, but there's a variety of facets. I think by having our Intel centers, that helps us tremendously to track that data so that we can develop of best practices. But that's a continual process that we continue to employ.
I'm happy to.
Sure.
And just to the point on domestic violence, the governor invested in this year's budget $35 million specifically for law enforcement strategies to reduce domestic violence. And we are working now on very similar strategies to work with local partners, use evidence-based strategies similar to how we do GIVE to drive down domestic violence fatalities and injuries. So I think there'll be more to share on that as we launch that effort.